Hello, Happy New Year. Welcome to Sport and Lot for 2024 with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, as ever, joined by Martyn Ziegler from The Times, Tariq Panja from The New York Times. And coming up, we'll ask some of the big questions of things in 2024 in sport, from financial fair play to FIFA to the Olympics and so much more. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year, guys. Rob, I think Tariq's going to be a big 2024. Lots of things happening, sports-wise and off the field too. Rob, I saw you on your TV reporting from probably the first time you've reported on a live sports event involving darts, is it? Alexandra Palace in London?
And reporting from the first World Championships, I figured, of the year as well. I don't think we've mentioned darts particularly on here, but it's not just captivated the UK. You get a real sense of how in Germany and even across Asia as well, and perhaps cracking parts of the US, that it's really growing, and obviously because of a 16-year-old reaching the final.
Yeah, this is Luke Littler, 16, going on 36. He's got a sort of easy. I think he finds it easier to grow a beard than I do. But but he has certainly taken the country by storm. It's been on the front pages of every paper, even though he lost in the final. And also, interestingly, Sky Sports saw a massive rise in their viewership. They were getting for the darts World Champion similar figures for Premier League matches. In fact, the average for the semi-finals was higher than their average for a Premier League match, which just shows that been some significant numbers, like 2.3 million people tuning in to watch.
That's an incredible number, that 2.3 million on a paid channel. Luke Littler's done a huge amount for darts. Rob, being in the arena, what's it like there? Because we're watching it on telly. It looks like a giant fancy dress party in the background, and these guys playing high-level darts just in front of that. What was it like being in the room?
Well, I was up at the Oki, right by the board, just before it all started, and it's a lot more intimate and tightly packed than you imagine. There's only a few thousand fans able to fit in. I think about 3,000 or 4,000 in Alexandra Palace. I am very aware we haven't mentioned who actually won, which was the other Luke Humphries, actually the new world number one. It was an all-English final. Alexandra Palace is pretty interesting when we're talking about TV ratings too, because, if I got it right, it was the place of the world's first TV transmission back for the BBC, 100 or so years ago.
Yeah, incredible venue that up on the hill there. And
it's not actually a palace for the royal family, for those perhaps less familiar around the world, is it?
No,
I never
palace
knew
for
that.
darts. Certainly a palace for darts. You mentioned Luke Humphries there, and again, for him as well, he was a great advert for someone who's battled through adversity as well. There was talk of suffering from depression and anxiety when it came to playing darts on that big stage, and he's accomplished his dreams there, winning the World Championship. So in amongst all the Luke Littler stuff, for anyone suffering from depression or anxiety or anything like that, what a great example he was as well. And
it's interesting when you hear more about the players, how they sort of train as well. It was something particularly Luke Littler got into a lot more in terms of finessing his skills during lockdown, because you can play on boards against opponents all around the world, and the data is fed into them, and you're able to sort of be engaged in that way. So particularly when everyone's sort of locked away, it's a way of maintaining that connection beyond, say, just playing video games, as many sort of might have done.
Yeah, there have been a few. Certainly, I know Oliver Brown in the Daily Telegraph sort of question whether darts should be regarded as a sport, because people only half jokingly say it should be in the Olympics. I guess that's probably because of the sort of historical nature of it, and lots of the sort of famous people from the 80s and 90s, but sort of very large gentlemen. That perhaps people say it should, it's not a sport. But I get, is it any different to archery or shooting or anything like that? I think it's the same.
It is based on skill and scores being achieved by players within a match. It's not sort of judgment based, which things like artistic gymnastics as well are more fundamentally based around, where you've got to have some sort of those judgment calls. This is, can you get from 501 down to 0? And, there are numerical skills involved as well. Those players really have to think on their feet in terms of, if they hit a 19 instead of a 10, then they've got to readjust the calculations, what they've got to do and what is best in terms of the target. So, it's a pretty good educational tool as well, particularly as it's sort of moved away, at least for the player sense, beyond complete drinking. There's not booze up on stage, though the room pretty much stinks of a drink, and it is pretty heavy in terms of a lot of people drinking, and quite a lot of an older audience as well. Certainly not many kids in the crowd. And as you're saying, there is the thing about fancy dress, people dressed as cones, Smurfs, astronauts, so many sort of outfits has become part of it. And it's a place where, people have Christmas parties because it starts before Christmas, continues all the way throughout into the start of the new year with breaks on New Year's Day and Christmas Day around then.
Yeah, the atmosphere looked fantastic there, didn't it? It's like a party two times a day for a month. I think with that professional sport being played in front of it, quite a scene. So as an event, as somewhere to go, it really has a high standing, hasn't it?
Yeah, and talk to people at the venue. There's a sense that they want to keep it as something that's in demand, so you don't go to a larger venue, even though they might be able to sell out an arena like the O2 perhaps for the finals. That almost a niche element to it is something that's craved. I suppose as we broaden it out to those who aren't darts followers, perhaps a couple of questions as we start this sort of questions for 2024. In terms of prize money, it's pretty low in the world of sport, but big for these darts players. £500,000 for the winner, 200,000 for runner-up. So 16-year-old Luke Littler banking pretty nice windfall. But are there things other sports could learn from darts to get this sort of attention?
I mean, it's difficult because, all sport is basically personality-based, isn't it? So in many ways, what Luke Little has shown is that if you have some sort of personality or some sort of story to tell, that can grab the imagination. And I think all sports try to seize onto that. The only thing you'd say about darts, it's probably not one that the Saudis will try and get a breakaway tournament against, because I can't see that sort of atmosphere being replicated in Riyadh.
Did we say that about boxing, though? And they've attracted the fights there.
Oh, yeah, boxing. But, boxing is, I think darts and drinking beer go hand in hand. You might say that about football too, but I think particularly darts. So I think that would be a push too far.
There is an event coming up.
A throw too far.
There is an event coming up in Bahrain, but you can drink in places in Bahrain. Drink alcohol, that is.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, maybe I'm being too doom and gloom about Saudi taking over darts.
But it would be a cheap way into buying a sport. Maybe we talked about it before with Qatar and paddle, getting involved in a sport that's sort of at the lower end, doesn't need that much spent on it to gain a foothold and control. If a country like Saudi or another entity wanted to, you could attach yourself to the sport without having to invest much in terms of initial outlay.
Yeah, that's true. And it is very obviously cheap to cover from a broadcasting point of view. It's not, it's a minimal number of cameras. I was going to say that sort of expense is very minor. So
I never imagined we'd be talking so much about darts, but hopefully some insight for those less familiar around the world. But I feel for the first big question of this pod of questions, we should go all the way back to where we began with the first edition in 2021, 3 years ago. We addressed it briefly before the break, but let's touch on it now. Will there be a Super League?
No, and not in 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028. What do you think, Tariq?
So Zeeks thinks there's a Super League in 2029. Mark that on your cards. What do I think? I don't think there's going to be a Super League. I think that word needs to, or that collection of words needs to be removed. I think calling anything a Super League is just useless now. I think what could happen, and we talked about before, is the clubs they could create their own competition along the lines of what they have now, basically just seizing power from UEFA. That could happen. Will it happen? I don't know.
And as we've had more time to digest that verdict, how do we think about it now? Is it actually about more power to the clubs? Martyn, you've written about a complaint from UEFA to the European Court of Justice about how they worded their press release, and a lot of the initial assessments were formed on how the press release was worded about the UEFA and FIFA monopoly.
Yeah, so this is UEFA's lawyers have sent a letter to the European Court of Justice basically saying that what the press release said wasn't backed up by the actual full findings of the judgment. That they didn't sort of make clear all the nuances and the fact that UEFA can still seek exemptions, even if it is broadly the sports bodies that go against European law, that they can still seek exemptions. So, but I was interested, Tariq, because you said in the pod talking about it that it looked as though the press release had been written slightly tabloidy. So, I mean, I suppose they want to try and grab attention. I suppose it's a question of whether it grabbed too much.
Yeah, it's a good point there. I mean, you remember when it dropped, everyone was in a panic, particularly at UEFA when they saw that first release there from the European Court of Justice, and then right at the top, the UEFA is running, unlawfully. What it's done is unlawful. All of these trigger words that panicked the hell out of everyone, and also us thinking, right, we got a massive story here that we weren't expecting. But I don't know. Do they need to rewrite the press release? Water under the bridge now, isn't it? I mean, what's the harm? What are they so upset about now? At the end of the day, it's about how the law is going to be used, isn't it?
It's a reminder for us as well to question how a press release is worded, what's highlighted, because organisations, whether it's this one or others, will choose to put something at the top of a press release. It often isn't the most interesting thing. We know that from governing bodies, that it can be the thing right buried down below that's more notable, or how something's phrased, or there's more detail that hasn't been mentioned in there, or something from a decision has been framed in a particular way as well.
What was kind of weird is, in my head, the idea of a European Court of Justice is a staid institution, very neutral. So maybe there is some shock in an organisation like that putting such a screeching headline out in a way to catch our attention in that way. It feels very unlike the kind of court legalese that we saw in that massive document that followed.
And it's why, Tariq, you argued in the last pod they should have perhaps done some sort of press conference to talk about their decision.
Oh, completely. I just think all of these, whereas this one, I think I talked about the Everton one as well with the Premier League. You have these very consequential decisions being made, and they're quite difficult to pass, and we've got more questions. Just to get the right answer, it might be helpful if the people who are behind the decisions are able to be made available.
I contacted the guy who's the head of communications at the ECJ, Juan Carlos Gonzalez Alvarez, and asked him about this letter. And he wouldn't respond up to the UEFA's letter of complaint, but he did point out that the press release contained a footnote which says that this is a, quotes, unofficial document for media use, not binding on the Court of Justice, close quotes. That's a sort of crazy thing. Oh, well, this isn't, whatever this press release states isn't binding on the Court of Justice. It's an unofficial document. What a sort of strange thing to say on a press release. I mean,
they should send out microscopes out as well with these releases, so we can read that little footnote at the bottom before we move on to the substance of the news.
Of course, this year we'll see the new Champions League launch, the one that really cements the power of the clubs because they're involved in the new Swiss model and the expansion of all that. While we are mentioning Super Leagues, there is one Super League at least that does exist in the world of football. It's the Women's Super League in England, and that will be getting a transformation with a new commercial model that is being implemented later this year for next season that we'll be hearing more from through the year. So while we're on the world of UEFA, what are the big challenges then for UEFA this year? They've got a Euros in Germany, men's Euros, the first big tournament for them. What post-pandemic, isn't it? Because Euro 20 20 men's held in 2021 had limited crowds, limited travel. So the last big event before then was 2016. We've had Champions League finals with challenges in the past. And for Germany, their first big tournament since the Men's World Cup of 2006. So how much of a challenge do UEFA face this year?
I don't think the Euros is particularly challenging. I mean, it's one country, which makes it easier. You're not sort of dealing with several governments. They've got plenty of experience in major tournaments, so I think it's going to be fairly straightforward. I think the bigger challenge is the new Champions League format and getting the public to understand how it works. The Swiss model, you've got 36 teams in a single league. Each club plays 8 other clubs, some home, some away, and it goes the results go into one league table. I mean, I think it could be quite good because I think the current format needs refreshing. But I think the challenge is going to be selling it to the public so they understand it.
Well, it's pretty simple for the public to understand, I'd say. All they have to do is download us and listen to us.
Exactly. And we've been talking about it for a long time. I agree with Martyn. It was for me in need of a refresh, that group stage. They'll be hoping this thing works, and there's another element to it. There's that extra element of jeopardy with the teams that finish between, in the 16 places beneath 8th in that knockout round, which could be really compelling TV. So that could be a big kind of excitement developer for
one of the things that sort of catches up on people. I'd say, what? There's another round.
Yeah, and exactly.
You won't realise it. A bit like we're sort of waiting to see which country will actually get the 5th Champions League place as well for this men's competition. Sorry, that's in a very English and Spanish and context by saying 5th place. Obviously, an extra place, perhaps it would be for Italy and others.
Well, I wouldn't be so sure about the English getting a 5th place. Martyn, you were doing some numbers, weren't you, recently?
Yeah, so the fact that Manchester United and Newcastle United were knocked out of the Champions League, that damages England's chances significantly. So I think a lot depends now on how far Arsenal, Manchester City can go in the Champions League, Liverpool in the Europa League. The further they go, the more chance they have of getting a 5th spot. But the Italians and the Spanish are doing very well. I think the Spanish have got four clubs in the knockout stages of the Champions League. So, and the Germans, I think the Germans are out, as things stand, are out in front. So
that's the future of the Champions League. Something on UEFA's plate that they tried to address last year is the fate of Russian teams. So, will Russian teams be brought back into football in 2024? So they did attempt to bring the youth teams back, UEFA, then had to sort of backtrack on that. It's a big question, and without getting too heavily into politics, does it link to what happens in the US election? Who wins in the US election? What happens to Western support for Ukraine in terms of the invasion of Russia and Ukraine's ability to fend that off? Are there far bigger things at play rather than it just being about, does football decide whether to bring Russian teams back, and what will it take?
I think, we're recording this a few days after a massive bombardment of Ukraine, major cities, including Kiev. The war is still on. While this level of fighting takes place and there is no kind of sign of any settlement of any kind, it's very hard to see how sport rows back and says, actually, the conditions are such that Russian teams can return. Because don't forget, Russian teams aren't banned because of a political decision. The decision was taken because many countries and teams aren't playing there. This is almost out of UEFA's hands. This was almost a force majeure when you have a bunch of countries saying we're not going to participate against these guys, or they're not going to be allowed in our country. They just won't be allowed to play, will they? Can you see that happening, Martyn?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the IOC have been, although they've been sort of like paving the way for individuals to compete as neutrals at Olympics, that they haven't included teams. And I think that, if the IOC take that stance, and I think it's quite difficult for other international federations to row back from that. And UEFA tried and failed with the junior teams, and I think it'd be a big embarrassment if they tried to do it again. So I think they would probably not try.
Well, Rob, can you imagine in the Champions League, Zenit St. Petersburg regulars in the competition, a very big team. Can you imagine anyone, Polish teams, maybe even English teams, saying that we're going to have an away game in St. Petersburg? It's really hard to see, isn't it?
It is, but for many years, UEFA have had to separate various countries' teams from playing, including teams from Spain and Gibraltar as well in European qualifying. So it's not just a sort of Russia matter, but I think we got a sense of the complexity of the decision when it was highlighted by the Jordanian Football Association in issuing a call for Israel to be banned from sporting competitions this week. And it's a war with very different complexions to discuss, but it just shows that could be one of the brewing issues that comes through in 2024 as well.
Mm-hmm. Just to go back to Russia, I think the British government would actually block English clubs from playing. And for example, just on a sort of technical level, West Ham United's accounts came out this week and showed that they owe just under £14 million to CSKA Moscow for the signing of Nikola Vlasic from 2020. Basically, say they're not allowed to pay that transfer debt to CSKA because of the club's ownership. So, are they going to allow clubs to go? I doubt it.
One that's sure to be revisited through the year. As for FIFA, a big question that might have a very simple answer. Well, they got to decide this year World Cup bids for the men's tournament and the women's tournament too. So, will Saudi win the bid for the 2034 World Cup? We don't want to give any spoiler alerts here.
Who's opposing them? I can't remember.
Well, it's going to be a real close run thing, isn't it, guys? Just to remind the listeners, the sole bidder, Saudi Arabia, for the 2034 bid just suddenly dropped on the world on the same day as FIFA announced the sole candidates for the 2030 World Cup, which is 6 countries across 3 continents, in a way removing any sense of opposition to continents who could potentially bid for 2034. Was it all a big plan?
You may say that, Tariq. I couldn't possibly comment.
And of course, we have 2030 as well. That will be ratified with those 6 countries combined into one bid from Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, the primary host, but with a game each kicking off in Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this and the sort of environmental challenges. South America, they could get the Women's World Cup, couldn't they?
Yes, yeah. Brazil have felt they're the front runners for that tournament. However, in the last weeks, there's chaos in the Brazilian FA. The president has been removed. Reginaldo Rodrigues, an interim, has been appointed because when he was elected in 2022, the court found some irregularities in the process. FIFA has now stepped in and has threatened to slap Brazil with a ban. Can you imagine? It's not going to happen, is it? Brazil being banned from international football. Can you imagine the team that is kind of the most iconic World Cup team in many ways not being at a World Cup?
And with the Copa America this year as well. But although CONMEBOL wouldn't ban them as well, would they?
No,
I would think not.
No, you would think not. But yeah, the women's World Cup looked like it was going to Brazil, but I wonder if any of these issues might prevent that from happening.
This is a competitive contest. We have got 3 bids. So up against Brazil is the North American Challenge from Mexico and the United States combined, and then 3 combined from Europe, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. There will be a decision by the FIFA Congress, the first time that's happened for the Women's World Cup. So all FIFA members get a vote, even those without women's teams. And certainly many of the 211 dozen still don't do. And we have had the bid books being published, human rights assessments. This is the transparency that has been called for, that FIFA has lived up to in this Women's World Cup bidding contest. So you can go through all the documentation that's there about the entries, and then it'll be part of a bid evaluation that will be published too. So this sort of competitive process, that is the democratic side of bidding. Many questions actually still, of course. Is it right to have declared bidders? Does it influence who you do vote for when people know who you voted for? Good news for all the consultants and bidding world people as well.
Just Rob, just to be clear here, who vote? Is it it's the council that decides the Women's World Cup, or is it the Congress? Has it been moved to the Congress to align with the men's competition?
It has been, and actually, I did do a report in early 2019 about how FIFA selected the 2023 World Cup without the same openness of the process as the men's tournament at the time. They made a big play about the 2026 Men's World Cup being this new big open process, not the closed council voting, but the Congress. And I remember doing a report pointing out the inconsistency in the Women's World Cup maintaining the older closed council way of voting, and it was sort of challenged about why we made an issue out of it. Within weeks, FIFA had announced a change plans for the 2027 contest. So it is the entire membership that will vote and will know who they voted for.
Well, so what dates are we looking at now for this, Martyn? How many congresses are we going to have for these decisions?
Well, I think May the 17th is the FIFA Congress in Bangkok, where they will take the vote on the Women's World Cup. And then I think there's going to be another one in the end of, I think they've said the autumn for 2030. And possibly they'll do 2034 as well. I mean, they could have separate congresses on consecutive days, because they can't, according to the statutes, they can't vote on consecutive World Cups in the same Congress. So it's going to be in a very short space of time. How short that space of time for 2030 and 2034 remains to be seen. But it would seem to be, if you have one Congress just to elect the 2030 host when there's only one bidder, and the same for 2034, what a waste of money and environmental carbon it would be to have two separate Congresses, thousands of miles apart, very close together.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, we've seen from FIFA that while the statutes are written the way they are, they're not always adhered to. We're talking about the 2034 World Cup. FIFA had said that only Asia and Oceania could bid for it, but if you look at their statutes, CONCACAF could as well. Whether they'd wanted to, given that the 2026 World Cup there is a different question. But the statutes were clear. They ignored those to make this decision. So presumably this council of wise men, if you want to call them that, this bureau of the vice presidents, who come up with some sort of way of making sure there aren't three congresses. That said, a lot of the FIFA members do like a bit of travel, don't they, Martyn? Rob?
Yeah, we saw that before the new year, didn't we, with the FIFA summit being held in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia before the Club World Cup final.
$500 a day per diem expenses for each person on that, as well as the free travel and accommodation, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, staying in the 5-star hotel, it's not easy, is it? So yeah, guys, I think the members aren't that bothered, are they? If they're going to be fed and watered, how many times you go? But it'll be hard for FIFA to then show up at events like COP, where Gianni Infantino did towards the end of last year, and talk about its commitment to the environment being paramount.
Some congratulations in order in the world of FIFA. Coming off the back of the Women's World Cup, FIFA's chief women's football officer, Sarai Bareman, being made a dame in the New Year's Honours list in New Zealand. The King also honouring Johanna Wood, the New Zealand FA chief and also a member of the FIFA Council. She's been appointed a companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Of course, King Charles also head of state for New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, the honours is a sort of, some might say, an anachronistic thing which happens in the UK, and also in some Commonwealth countries where the king is the head of state. FIFA haven't made a big deal of this, have they? About Sarai getting this on. I mean, it's quite, it's like equivalent of a knighthood, isn't it? But I've not seen anything of any media releases from them about this.
No, I haven't seen that. Sarai was a real front person, wasn't she, for the Women's World Cup that was successfully held in New Zealand and Australia, and as a citizen of New Zealand, probably would deserve that accolade. But it's funny, FIFA have released press releases for most of the year whenever its General Secretary, or former General Secretary now, Fatma Samora, was receiving all sorts of awards from, not to be harsh, a lot less distinguished awards than getting a damehood from a country, all sorts of World Football Forums and all sorts of things I remember getting press releases for. So it is a strange omission that FIFA haven't celebrated Sarai Bareman's gong.
Yeah, nothing on the Instagram feeds either at all, celebrating that, often sort of issuing a lot of, happy birthday wishes, but who knows? That omission from Gianni Infantino's feed, but certainly, yes, Sarai, one of those drivers of change and growth within the Women's World Cup, having played for Samoa herself.
I hope she's not starring in that new film about Samoan football.
I have actually seen it.
Any good?
It's a light sort of tale of what happens when a football nation is sort of trying to make a mark for itself. I suppose it's about how everyone just wants to have a chance to compete, really.
Yeah, it's not got good reviews, but it does sound like an interesting story. I think it's one of those, it's a bit cartoonish. We've seen the trailers and very, enormous goalkeeper, that sort of thing. It's sort of...
As with a lot of these things, I would recommend reading the book. I think it might be a bit better.
This is, of course, about American Samoa rather than Samoa, and it's at Next Goal Wins, and it was all about when they suffered the heaviest ever defeat in world football history, wasn't it? The men's team.
Yeah, I think it was 31-0 against Australia, maybe 15, 20 years ago now. Archie Thompson, I think, scored 10 goals in that game for Australia, swiftly emerging as one of Australia's highest ever goal scorers off the back of that.
Talking of which, it was only this week I saw about sovereign states that aren't members of a FIFA confederation. Vatican City, Monaco, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, and the Federated States of Micronesia.
Yeah, I think it's more surprising some of the states that have got football teams, but than those that haven't.
It's not a bad way to get rich either. You once you get noticed and recognised, you can actually get quite a lot of money from those governing bodies. So,
on money in FIFA, how are things with their move to Paris?
You've covered this, haven't you, Tariq, about the French proposed tax breaks Emmanuel Macron was trying to bring in for sports bodies, and some French MPs said this was just rolling out the red carpet for FIFA as they've got an office there to try and get them to move their headquarters. But a bit of a blow to those hopes.
Yeah, this was a scheme being pushed forward by Emmanuel Macron's government. I talked to the MP lawmaker who was pushing this, Mr. Lefebvre, and he said it was part of Macron's plan to make France great again. Cringe. It's this kind of pro-business approach from Macron, and it has failed. And the plan would have been for all the sports bodies recognised by the AOC, about 30 of them, to be able to move to France and to get all sorts of tax benefits for non-commercial activities and for their staff, if for the first 5 years to be basically paid tax-free. And there was huge pushback both in the Senate and Parliament. The government tried to push this through, but it's the French Constitutional Council which basically said that it breached the laws of France on equality before the law, and it looks like this is now consigned to the garbage for now.
Would have been quite something of all the employees having a 5-year tax-free Well, tax holiday, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, employee number one, Gianni Infantino, you're looking at around $2 million. And then if you're not paying tax on that, you're happy days for him. But the FIFA staff are quite well remunerated, and their tax situation in Switzerland isn't that bad, is it, really?
While we're on matters, France, Olympic and Paralympic year in Paris. Will Paris pass the games test?
I mean, I think we've spoken about the security challenges Paris face before a few times, and I do think that's going to be the biggest obstacle because the way things are, the way the games are being planned, that the sort of the opening ceremony on the Seine, the sort of history that Paris has had of terrorist attacks. I know security analysts are warning national Olympic committees that there is a significant risk of some sort of attack happening. So that, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge for the organisers.
Yeah, I mean, it's undoubtedly a daunting task, but there is, if you talk to them, they're definitely saying they're pushing ahead with this, despite all the events happening in the world right now. And this is 4 kilometers of the Seine. And the event is going to have hundreds of thousands of people there. Partly, it will all be ticketed, they're saying, with the lower banks of the Seine paid for, and the top of the banks there ticketed but free to French people who register on a website. They have had questions from various Olympic committees, anxious questions about how the athletes are going to be protected. But not only that, just how they're going to keep them comfortable being on these boats for so long. Don't forget, these athletes are coming into the most important event of their lives in many cases, and you don't want anything to disrupt that.
Yeah, it's not going down the Seine with a load of booze on the boat.
No. The other challenge, I think, is actually the French they do and have in the past put together some, thinking of Euro 2016, they've dealt with the sort of huge numbers of people coming in, so they do have these sort of security plans, but it's whether the security services and the CRS riot police, if they can sort of avoid situations where they overreact, because I think there is definitely have a reputation for going in hard first, asking questions later, and at the Olympics, if that starts happening, then that could be pretty embarrassing. And we saw it at Paris for the Champions League final, the police's sort of attitude to the Liverpool fans, basically treating them as effective, hooligans in the making, and that caused huge problems.
That will be, as is usual, it's quite a different crowd at an Olympics, and in fact, it's the first potentially mass attended Olympics since London 2012 due to the pandemic, and before then perhaps less appealing games to attend, as we saw with the Brazilian public perhaps not on board fully with the Rio 2016 games. Things like football attracted the big crowds, but less so at other sports, and it was more expensive people to fly in from around the world. So certainly well placed the Paris Games for people from across Europe to go in by rail and by road as well, which should create quite an atmosphere. And say for the IOC that on a more positive front, big thing for them is, will the new sports make the impact they're hoping for to reach the new young audiences? They've got breaking, breakdancing, sport climbing, skateboarding and surfing in Tahiti, all the way in Tahiti.
Well, that's proven to be the most controversial one of the lot in terms of building the judges panel there on the coral. Big disputes there over how that's been done. Some coral has already been damaged, and environmentalists are furious, as well as some Tahitian local surfers and people connected to the island. But it looks like that will go ahead. Again, this seems like a Macron idea above anything else. The other sports, Martyn, big breakdance fan yourself. Is that something you're looking forward to?
Well, I was thinking of entering at one point, but I've decided against it.
Is that hamstring again?
Achilles this time, Achilles. But
you should be showing off your moves. I'll see it.
The other thing be interesting to know for the IOC ethics board if it maybe you think it will come to an end of its investigation into bribery around the votes for 2016 and 2020 Olympics. Do you think any chance of that? People like Frankie Fredericks, Carlos Newsman. What do you think? Any likelihood of that being dealt with this 2024?
This has been a process ongoing for years, and while there's a lot of spotlight on, say, in football terms, investigations into Qatar, and it was something talked about around their World Cup, many did raise the question, particularly from, say, a country like Qatar, why is Japan not getting a focus when there are so many investigations into their bidding? And perhaps it's as much of a media thing where we don't give it the attention. And once the games has moved on, then the focus moves on as well once it's closed. But what will happen to it?
There's also with Japan, I've found the linguistic challenge is quite difficult. Obviously, the three of us sitting here in London, we've got that the time zone, but also just trying to get access to documents is just that little bit harder. Not to say it's impossible. And there has been reporting. Stephen Wade of the Associated Press has reported on what's happening there. He's based in Tokyo. There's been a trial of Dentsu executives, this big advertising agency linked to massive corruption scandal in the Tokyo 2020 Olympics there. But yeah, the IOC seem to be unable to conclude any of their investigations from what I've seen.
It's coming up to 7 years since Frankie Fredericks was suspended. 7 years.
That is a long time. Well, what about another investigation as we close up the pod? Let's go on to Premier League matters. Will 2024 be the year the Premier League's investigation into Manchester City concludes with a verdict on those 115 charges? The financial irregularities investigation.
Well, you'd hope it does, wouldn't you? I mean, Pep Guardiola 6 months ago or a bit earlier said he'd like to see it done tomorrow. And he's right. For Manchester City's reputation, they've been this winning machine playing this wonderful football, world champions now most recently, but with 115 charges hanging over them, that's just very difficult to overlook until it's concluded. Martyn, it's going to get done this year, surely, right?
Well, I'm going to bet you guys £1 each that the process of Manchester City won't be concluded before the end of 2024.
But I don't think it's a real stain, though, on the league and for the club as well. It's for everyone, isn't it? You can't have this enormous stain on years of titles, on this great Manchester City team, on this great Premier League international brand. It's probably second or bigger than, in some cases, the royal family in terms of its appeal globally. And you've got this massive stain there. It's just stuck to it.
The problem is when the Premier League are constrained by the investigation, the legal process, and having to make sure it is
right. Are they? So can we have someone explain that to us? We keep saying this. Can someone explain what these? We've had no one come up to explain what they're constrained by and why it's taking so long.
But isn't it the fact they've got the new regulations in place that ensure speedier investigations?
Just not on this one. Martyn, explain the new rules, please.
Yes. So just to go very quickly refer to the length of time taken. So even Derby County's sort of relatively straightforward FFP case when they were in the Championship, I think that took close to 2 years. That was relatively straightforward. But so the Premier League, the clubs basically realised that this sort of delays and timescale that was sort of fairly hopeless. So they have brought in new rules which applied this season. And interestingly, all clubs have to file their accounts to the Premier League by December the 31st every year. And then within 14 days, charges for a straightforward breach of spending rules, i.e. the profit and sustainability rules, you can only lose 105 million over 3 years, must be brought within that 14 days with a decision by early April and then appeal completed before the end of the season, i.e. before the end of May. So it has to be fast tracked. So this is the sort of thing we saw with Everton, a single breach of spending rules. And clubs are pretty worried about it. Some clubs already, they will find out in less than 2 weeks' time. Probably those most at risk are Nottingham Forest, because they've spent so heavily both in the Championship and also since they were promoted last season. And I think there's concerns at Everton as well, that if the same calculation system is used, that they could get a second profit and sustainability breach charge.
So what about Everton fans, Martyn? I think they're being picked on here. If you've mentioned Everton there again, Nottingham Forest, but then there are cases ongoing. Chelsea is another one. Man City, as we mentioned. So you're saying, so for the easy ones, they get done quickly. What about the complex ones? There's no time limit, is there? Or
no, there's nothing laid down about the time limits at all on those. So I think, and also, I don't think you can impose a time limit on cases that have sort of happened before the new rules are brought in anyway. But even so, I think it's perhaps difficult for very complex ones to put a time limit on, because you might find yourselves up against the High Court, and as we actually already saw during the investigation into Manchester City, lots of that, some of the issues around release of documents and information that actually went to the High Court, didn't it?
And there was a case, if I remember right, about being kept private, everything being kept behind the scenes. Given that this game is so popular and is very important to so many people in this country, that level of secrecy, is that correct?
Well, we wouldn't think so, of course. But the Premier League and Manchester City both tried to keep it under wraps, but due to a legal challenge by the Daily Mail, I think it was, or the Mail on Sunday, the judge in the High Court decided that those proceedings should be made public, and well done, that judge.
Well, that judge also said that City had won two championships since that investigation had opened, and asked them to speed up. I think they've won 2 more since he made those comments. Penny for his thoughts.
And the Club World Cup as well since we last recorded. And of course, since we last recorded, Manchester United finally announcing the deal agreed with Sir Jim Ratcliffe to buy 25% of the club through Ineos. Financial sustainability regulations will be affecting them as well in terms of how much they can spend. Certainly they bring the money into United. One of the issues has been it's not been well spent. Certainly a great payday this for the Glazers, isn't it? What they paid £790 million for United in 2005. It was a leveraged takeover, not requiring their own cash to be put in. They've claimed dividends. There's been all the interest payments on the debt. We're sort of talking about over £1 billion, aren't we? That, and now they're sort of making $1 billion, aren't they, or so, for the 25% stake being sold, and as well as that, sort of $300 million committed to invest in the stadium by Sir Jim Ratcliffe.
It's a deal of the century for them, isn't it? I mean, it's incredible. That amount that Jim Ratcliffe's paid for 25%, if you account for inflation, is pretty much what Manchester United was bought for in totality. And as you've mentioned, they put hardly anything of their own money in. They'd already got anything, the Glazers, everything they put in, the amounts, the small amount they put in back years ago through those dividends and then the share sale in the past. And they retain majority ownership. It's quite incredible what's happened there. No wonder they kept Ed Woodward along for so long.
Are they going to use the money from Ratcliffe to pay off the debt, do you think? Or is this just going to go straight to the Glazers? And also, are all the Glazers going to remain involved, or are some of the siblings going to just sell up their shareholding?
Well, that's to be made clear, isn't it? From the reading, it said there are the siblings stay together, but the two front people have always been Joel and Avi Glazer. I think they enjoy owning Manchester United despite all of that opposition from the particularly the match going public. Because if you think about it, you can be as rich as anything in the world, but there is only a few people, or at least for a long time, that one family that can say they own Manchester United. And there's that cachet to being attached to Manchester United opens all sorts of other doors. And from what I've heard, they've loved owning this institution. What happens in the future, Rob? It says that Jim Ratcliffe, Ineos guys, they're going to be running football operations. What does that mean in practice?
If they don't control the purse strings, ultimately, that's going to be one of the interesting things going forward, is the complete agreement between this Dave Brailsford operation, the former boss of British Cycling now, the chief of Ineos Sport, who's involved in decision-making, is already be seen at games. Can they agree on how the money's spent, particularly because they need it being released from the club itself?
And another issue, actually, which is sort of aligned to this, is the UEFA is going to just about started talking over the thorny issue of the multi-club ownership and what happens if clubs owned by the same people are in the competition together, because it has been indicated by Alexander Scheffrin that might change. But Nice, obviously owned by Ineos. We've got Manchester City and Girona who riding high in La Liga. So, a thorny one, but I suppose made slightly easier for UEFA by the fact that you can no longer drop down from the Champions League to the Europa League in future.
You can, but as it stands, Martyn, if Girona finish above Manchester City in their respective league, or Nice finish above Manchester United in their respective league, and they're in the same tournament, the lower placed team finishes is knocked out, is not allowed to participate. Seeing UEFA's permissive behaviour over things like this, there is absolutely no chance, should this, in my opinion, should this eventuality appear, that they won't find a fix. We've already had decisions taken this summer, AC Milan and Toulouse, for example, others that have allowed these teams to participate in their competitions.
Yeah, it might all come down to who's actually on the board of the company, and that's obviously if you've got different figures on the boards of Nice and Manchester United, that could be one of the ways that they comply with the rules. I mean, something interesting, we got a lot of detail on the deal itself in the US Securities and Exchange Commission documents, and they show things that the Glazers could actually have a complete sale still of the club in the next 18 months, and that Radcliffe would have to sell his shares.
Cool.
Are you saying there could be another sales process? The last year's been a lot of fun, hasn't it, guys? Can you imagine that? The Glazers putting United up for sale again next week.
Qataris are in.
Could someone phone Jassim? I mean, honestly, looking back, Martyn, Rob, this year of headlines around that Manchester United deal and the sale has just been bonkers. And, glad to see the back of that when it was announced.
It keeps us busy, though, doesn't it? Things to analyse, things to discuss, big questions to ask and answer about the world of sports politics, sports business.
Oh yeah, I'm not complaining about it at all. But the Manchester United takeover was one of those stories where it seems the same thing was being written every week.
As much something of our industry, perhaps.
Well, maybe.
To feed the interest and knowing it generated an audience. So some people keeping up with constant tweets or constant articles to feed the interest of fans desperate for any update.
Lot of engagement there, and just a thought for poor old Rio Ferdinand, who over the summer posted a video telling everyone that the sale to Sheikh Jassim was imminent. I think he was standing at a railway station, taking a selfie video to announce that. There was huge reaction to that moment. But who knows? In the future, maybe Rio, if the Glazers do sell it up again, maybe Sheikh Jassim comes back, and that prediction will come out to be true just a little bit later than you thought.
Maybe this will be the year we see more than one picture of Sheikh Jassim.
Well, yeah. Well, perhaps me, Rio Ferdinand, and me. Maybe we will both be saying "I told you so." Rio Ferdinand over the Sheikh Jassim, and me over the Manchester City's disciplinary financial case is actually dealt with.
Something
big year ahead.
A big year, and keep those questions coming in. Your thoughts, your comments at Sport Unlocked on X, Facebook, and Instagram, and always hit subscribe. You land in your feed automatically. But for now, the start of 2024. Thank you for listening to Sport Unlocked. Goodbye.